We are going to be in Haggai chapter 1. Haggai chapter 1. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes while you find it because it's this little tiny book that's probably on like one page of your Bible and you probably haven't read it in a while. So Haggai chapter 1. While you're looking for that, I'm going to just give you a little bit of kind of the historical background behind what's taking place here. I have good news. For the last 5 weeks, we have been beating the drum of death and destruction, right? Okay, you have been bad. God's going to destroy Jerusalem. The bad guys are coming. Repent, for the end is near. And then the bad guys came and they destroyed the city and everybody went and lived in exile. Good news, it's all over. Okay? They have returned to Jerusalem. In fact, the people of Israel will return to Jerusalem in 3 distinct groups. It'll take about 120 years for it to all happen. The first group, which we're going to read about today, is led by a man by the name of Zerubbabel, which is just one of the most fun names in the Old Testament. Someone should make a nursery rhyme about Zerubbabel and it'd be all sorts of fun. Little tongue twister in there. Zerubbabel is both a descendant of David and an ancestor of Jesus. He is in the royal line of kings for the nation of Israel, but he is not a king. Persia is still in charge of Israel. They've just been given a little bit of independence. And so Zerubbabel is called a governor. And he leads the first group of people back to Jerusalem in about 538 BC. And the very first thing they do when they arrive in Jerusalem is they rebuild the altar. Now, if you think about temple worship, right in the main courtyard is this massive altar upon which animal after animal after animal has been sacrificed through the years. Sheep and goats and all sorts of things, atonement sacrifices, and it has been lying in ruins for 7 decades. And the first thing they do is rebuild it and begin to offer sacrifices again, and it was an incredible moment for them. Last week we used the analogy of imagine if Russia had won the Cold War and destroyed all of our church buildings and exiled all the Christians to Siberia. So for a moment now, imagine that you were 15 and you left your home and you had been living in Siberia and it was against the law to go to church and against the law to pray and against the law to worship. And suddenly you get to come home and the very first thing you do is gather with other Christians, and the first time that pianist breaks out Amazing Grace, every eye tears up. Because you've been waiting decades for this moment. And so they rebuild this altar and they begin to worship again. Then they take up a collection and they begin to build the foundation for what will be the new temple. They lay the very beginnings of the new temple. About the time they finish the foundation, the Samaritans come down and say, hey, we'd like to help. Can we help you rebuild the temple? And, well, if you've read enough of the New Testament, you know that the Jews and Samaritans, they don't get along very well. And the Jews were like, thanks, but no thanks, go away. At which point the Samaritans said, oh, if you don't want our help, you ain't building it without us. And they began to harass them and to make political maneuvers. And essentially all construction on the temple stopped. And for 14 years, there was an altar and a foundation and nothing else. And everybody went and built their own homes. Everybody went and they began to go about their daily lives, and the temple continued to lie in ruins for 14 years. It is at this point that Haggai walks on the scene. And his prophecy is specifically spoken to Zerubbabel, and who is the governor of the area, and to Joshua, who is the high priest. So he's speaking specifically to these 2 guys who are in charge, and the question he has for them is, why haven't you finished the temple? You've been here for 14 years. You've done other things. Why does God's temple continue to lie unused in ruins? So we're going to pick up reading here in Haggai chapter 1, starting in verse 2, as Haggai speaks to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. Excuse me. The Lord of hosts says this, these people say, the time has not come for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. So the word of the Lord came through Haggai the prophet. Is it a time for you yourselves to live in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruin? Now the Lord of hosts says this, think carefully about your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough to be satisfied. You drink, but never have enough to become drunk. You put on clothes, but never have enough to get warm. The wage earner puts his wages into a bag with a hole into it. That's relatable sometimes, right? The Lord of hosts says this, think carefully about your ways. Go up into the hills and bring down lumber and build the house. Then I will be pleased with it and be glorified, says the Lord. You expected much, but then it amounted to little. When you brought the harvest to your house, I ruined it. Why? This is the declaration of the Lord of hosts, because my house still lies in ruins, while each of you is busy with his own house. Now, a lot of times we will walk piece by piece, bit by bit. I think today what we're going to do is I just want to point out a couple of overarching themes tucked in this passage in Haggai chapter 1. The first is this. This chapter is full of Old Testament covenant language. Now, if you've been following along with us, we've talked a lot about the covenant, and some of you are tired of hearing about the covenant, but I need to remind you again that God and the people of Israel, they made promises to each other. In fact, the language, for those of you who've been reading through the prophets with us, the imagery is they got married to each other. Okay? God refers to Israel as his wife, who he took home and made her his own. So they made these promises to each other that you'll do this and I'll do this. God, we will worship you and honor you and lift your name high, and God, in return, you're going to protect us and bless us and take care of us. So kind of at the tail end of that covenant in Deuteronomy 28 and 29, there is a section that is called covenant blessings and covenant curses. And the deal is simply, you keep the covenant, here's all the good stuff that's going to happen. If you don't keep the covenant, here's all the bad stuff that's going to happen. And so when Haggai begins to list those things, saying you plant much but harvest little, you put on clothes but you're never worn, he's pulling those directly out of the book of Deuteronomy. Those are the covenant curses. You have not honored me. You've not kept up your end of the bargain. In fact, my favorite evidence that this is part of the covenant language is all the way back at the beginning in verse 2. The Lord of hosts says this, these people say. Now we're going to stop just right there. Those of you who were here when we studied Jeremiah a few weeks back, we did a lot of study into kind of the affectionate shorthand God has for the people of Israel, right? I will be your God, and you will be my people. Shows up all the way through the Bible, all in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. I will be your God, you will be my people. He didn't call them his people, did he? You see, when God is mad at Israel, he doesn't say, my people say this. When the people have failed to keep the covenant, instead of saying my people, God says, these people. It's kind of like when you were in trouble as a little kid and your mama used your middle name. Joseph Joshua, get down from there. You don't even have to have the mean tone of voice. You can say it nice and sweet. Joseph Joshua, get over here right now. And you know you're in trouble, right? Like the mama breaks out the middle name and you know things have not gone well for you. When God begins a prophecy, these people, you know that he's not super thrilled with them. And so he begins to walk them through kind of the consequences of their decisions. The second thing I want to point out is that this is not about God needing a house. God was not a homeless beggar pushing his shopping cart around going, please build me a home. This is an issue of the priorities of the people of Israel. That they have decided it is more important for them to live in nice homes. That phrase, paneled houses, refers to a home lined with cedar planks. Cedar was not cheap. So essentially, Joshua and Zerubbabel have built these really nice homes for themselves, and they're living a life of luxury while the temple goes untended. The problem is not that God needs a place to stay. Listen, God lived in a tent in the wilderness with them for a really long time. And before the tabernacle, he ran around as a pillar of fire. In Ezekiel that we studied a couple weeks ago, he shows up on his moving chariot, his moving throne room. God's not confined to a temple. This isn't about God being upset that he doesn't have a bed to sleep in. This is about the fact that the hearts of the people of Israel have decided their own job and their own home and their own life is more important than the worship of God. This is an issue of priorities. It's an issue of where their heart is. And God's problem with them, God's anger with them, is that they have decided there are things in life more important than the worship of his name. And so he's upset with them. The third thing that I notice as I read this is the repeated phrase. Haggai is only 2 chapters long. The phrase appears 3 times in 2 chapters. The first time we read it is there in verse 5. Now the Lord of hosts says this, think carefully about your ways. We read it again in verse 7. The Lord of hosts says this, think carefully about your ways. You see, this is even worse than mom using your middle name. This is mom using your middle name and sending you to your room to think about what you've done. Now, some of you may be the kind of people that you're like, cool, I get to go lay down in my bed and nobody's going to bother me. But if you happen to be one of those people whose mind runs 1,000,000 miles an hour and you replay the conversation in your head 1,000 times, and you think, well, this is what I would have said. This is what I should have said. I can't believe I said what I said. There is not much worse in this world. Go stand in the corner and think about what you've said. Okay. God's commandment to the people of Israel, specifically to the leadership of Israel, is this. Go think about what you've done. Go think about the fact that your temple was destroyed, and for 70 years you cried out in anguish for me to free you. For 70 years you complained about not being able to worship me. For 70 years you lived in exile, and all you wanted was to come back. And now here you are, I delivered you to the promised land, and for 14 years you've done nothing. You've only been worried about yourself and your own life and your own future. You go think about what you have done. The book of Haggai continues to call them to rebuild the temple, to finish the work, so that God's name may be lifted high and glorified. In its ancient context, that's all Haggai actually means. It is a specific prophecy to the people of Israel. Get your act together. Get your act together. God deserves to be the first and most important priority in your life. For us this morning, I want to focus just on that third idea. What does it mean to think carefully about your ways for you and me? What does it mean to examine our own priorities, our own relationship with the worship of God? What does it look like to think carefully about our ways? I'm going to do that with an object lesson. It's an old one. I've done it before. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. But it's never hurts to be reminded of things. So, in fact, it's kind of one of those that's been floating around online for several years. Maybe you've even read the story if you haven't actually seen it done. So we're going to just do a little bit of an object lesson for you this morning. The story that you read online, the version that floats around is this, that a college professor invited his class and he was going to give them some basic life advice, and so he brought out an empty glass container that looks like this. And he said to them that he was going to place these large stones, and I'm going to try to do it very gently so I don't shatter the glass while I'm on stage, because that'd be really awkward. I'm going to fill the container up with said glass stones, or said large stones. And he showed them the container and said, what do you think? Is it full? And of course the response from the students is, there may be a little bit of room on top, but for the most part, yeah, you filled the container up. And so then he reached down and he pulled out his jar of smaller gravel. And he takes the same container that's already full, mind you, and he begins to pour in the smaller gravel. And my rock shifted on me, so we'll have to finagle a little bit. Ugh. Got it wedged in there. He begins to shake the jar around, and you can see all those empty spots that once were full, or once were empty, begin. This is not working as well as when I practiced last night. My rock got wedged in there. That there actually was quite a bit of empty space in the jar. And so he asked again the question, how full does my jar look? I say, it's mostly full. Now, he probably didn't have his rocks wedged all funky, so it looked fuller than it is. And so then he pulls out his jar of sand. He begins to add sand. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to do this all the way down because I practiced last night, and one, I made a mess because it's sand. And 2, to shake that much sand to fill all of the gaps would take me a half hour, and you don't want to watch me shake a jar of sand for a half hour. But I wanted to show you that even where it looks like it's full and packed, you can begin to get sand to shift down in between those little tiny crevices and fill it up even more. And so he said, now does it look like it's full? And of course they're going, yeah, it's all the way full. There's sand all the way to the top. There's absolutely no way anything else could go in there. And then the professor pulls out his pitcher of water. And he begins to pour his water in. And the water begins to creep down and slowly fill in whatever little cracks and crevices might be left. It dribbles its way down there, slowly but surely. And we'll have to wait. I'll keep talking, but it'll go down there. Just if I shake it, it'll make a mess. So it'll slowly begin to seep through the sand and fill up further and further and further and further. And so as he's doing this, and he finishes up, and he's got water all the way to the top, he then asks them the question, what do you think the point of that is? What do you think the application is? And of course, being good, modern American college students, I say, well, the answer's simple. No matter how busy you are, you can always cram something else into your life. Which some of you live that way and feel that way. He says, oh, no, that's not the point. Because the point is, if you don't put the big rocks in first, they're never going to go in. If you add the water first, you'll never get anything else in the jar. He says the jar represents your life, that you have so much energy, so much time, so much giftedness, so much passion to offer. And you have to decide what goes in first. What are the really important things in your life? What are the things that really matter? What are the things that are non-negotiable? And they have to go in first. Because if you don't put them in first, these other little things that are not nearly as important and they don't take up as much time, but they will begin to seep in and fill up. And if you put the sand in first, there's no room left for the big rocks. You fill the container with sand and you'll never get any big rocks in there. And so he challenges them and he says to them, what are the big rocks in your life? What are the important things that you have to make time and space and energy for and say, this is most important and everything else has to fit around these big rocks. And if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit, but the big rocks are going in. And he says, well, maybe for you it's family, maybe for you it's friends, maybe for you it's your job, and he begins this long spiel. Let me just tell you this morning, if you are a follower of Christ, the big rock is your worship and obedience to God and Jesus Christ. And that's a simple non-negotiable. And I am so aware of how easy it is for the busyness of other things to seep into that. I'm so aware of the pressures to, those of you who have kids, to have kids involved in everything all the time and chasing all of those goals. I'm so aware of the pressures to chase the American dream and to have all of these vacations and all of these goals and all this accomplishment at your job and all. I'm aware of all of that. Listen, I live in the same world you live in. I'm so aware of those of you who are retired that you worked your whole life now and you want a vacation and be done and enjoy life. It's a long way away for some of us. I am so aware of how easy it is for other stuff to seep in and to steal those minutes and those hours and those days. And it could be something as big as a sports season, something as small as a Netflix series that you watch far too long at night. It could be something that you spend money on as big as I have to have my dream home, or as small as a Diet Mountain Dew addiction. Not judging anyone but me. But I'm just telling you, whether it's your finances, if you do not give to God first, you will come to the end of the month and find no room left for Him. Or your time, if you do not commit to biblical study, to prayer, to church fellowship, to service, to the things God calls His followers to do, if you don't put that in first, you'll come to the end of the week and you won't have any energy left. And you won't have any days left. And it'll slip away. if it's your giftedness and your I'm just telling you the way life works is that we have all of these little things that want to steal just moments and dollars and seconds from us, and we come to the end of each week and we go, man, I did not do what I was going to do. I don't think the people of Israel were bad. I don't think the people of Israel set out to go, you know what, we're done with this whole temple thing, forget it. As I read the story in the first few chapters of Ezra, it kind of lays out the narrative for us. Exactly what happened is it got hard, and they had other things that they wanted to get done. And I guarantee you they said to themselves, well, when I finish my house, then I'll get things right with the temple. Sounds a lot to people like me. Well, when my kids are grown, then I'll have more time to serve. Well, once my kids are done with school, then I'll be able to give the way I want to give. Well, when I have some free time, then I'll start reading the Bible again. I learned a long time ago, if you're waiting for the day when you have free time, it's not coming. And as the followers of Christ, we have to decide that the worship of and obedience to our God is the big rock. And it goes in first. And whatever else fills in around it is fine. But if you wait to put it until last, there just won't be any room left. I had Tracy read this morning. This idea is picked up in the New Testament. There's this lengthy section in Matthew chapter 6 where Matthew writes that people worry about what they're going to wear or what they're going to eat, and they make their lives about this material possession thing and caring about my own needs and geeking it through tomorrow. And essentially, the thrust of Jesus' teaching in Matthew 6 is, don't worry about that. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and everything else will take care of itself. All these things will be added unto you, He says. Seek God, seek His kingdom, pursue Him with your whole heart all the time, and everything else will take care of itself. God's kingdom is the big rock. Everything else will take care of itself.